Greetings, Marsh here, and welcome to episode 132 of my modded Factorio playthrough. In the last episode, we got our new circuit production bus set up, and it's running nice and cleanly, at least for what it could run. Unfortunately, our night vision doesn't show us what's happening when we're looking at radars. I don't know, maybe there's a mod for that. Probably should check into that, because that would be kind of nice. But it looks like it's stabilized. It caught up as best it could. And from here, the next step is to replace our science setup. And we can add some new science. For one, we can do the military packs, or the black packs, which unlock all these various stages. They require the new resources that we are producing. Some of these new processes create these byproducts, which you can turn back into ore, which is interesting. But that'll make the military pack, so might as well grab that. I'm thinking I want to avoid working on blue science for now. Oh wow, that's going to go real fast. Just because the resource requirements are so high that we're looking at like 140 copper a second. I was originally thinking, yeah, let's just go straight into blue science. But because of that, I kind of want to wait, because we can pretty much do modules now. And that's kind of the point of having that separate electronics bus. It's not just to make electronics, but to make modules, which, as you see, are made from a lot of the same stuff. So they can all happen in the same area. And if we follow that down, we can get productivity modules, which of course are the most OP thing in the game. And I have the settings on Bob's to basically nerf these things so they're not so insane. But they're still pretty good. So 10% more energy consumption, 25% less speed, and 15% more pollution, but you get 5% productivity, and of course they tier higher than that. Now you can't use these on everything because of the nerfs. You can only use them on certain things. The most notable things you can use them on are machines that turn coils into plates or wires. So for example, let's just do a little test here, where we can say we want copper plates, and we'll take them from coils, and let's say we want 30 plates a second. And there's the coil requirement, and then we can go in here to figure out how many ingots we want. So that's 30 ingots a second. Now luckily these recipes are pretty smart, so they won't let you put modules in there that you can't use. So we can't put productivity modules in the induction furnace. We can't put them in the strand crafting machine. But if you upgraded your factory to use coils, you can put them in here. So if we put 2 productivity module 2s, which is what we can fit in that early machine, now we've cut our resources down from 30 ingots to 25. So it actually has a pretty profound reduction when you put those productivity modules in everything that goes into blue science. And I did that calculation earlier. It's kind of tedious to go through all that, but it lowered the requirement of copper plates from like this 156, well, I guess it's less, it's more like 140 because you get some back, to about 80. So it's like 140 down to 80 by using those productivity modules. So I'm thinking we probably want to do modules. I really didn't want to get into it right now, just because it's kind of complicated process if you haven't started on them yet. But I think I want to do those before blue science. That's kind of why I'm going to put blue science on the back burner. We'll still build it on this new bus here, but for now, let's concentrate on the military science. And of course the red and green sciences as well. And I don't know if you noticed, but it's nighttime right now. Night vision is doing its job. It seems like this setup worked pretty well. That math is a little different when you have something you need to power all the time. So rather than 2 batteries per solar panel, it's more like 1 battery per solar panel with just these exact techs here. But this works pretty well. We get our belt immunity, we get our night vision, and it lasts throughout the day. And unfortunately, the hauler and the AI industry machines don't have grids on them, so we can't upgrade that. But we did upgrade the car. Pretty straightforward. This is plenty enough for the car to handle, so now it's not affected. So the great thing about equipment is that you can pick the vehicle up, put it back, put your fuel in, but it keeps the equipment. So that means we can pick up the car and move around, which is nice. And upgrading the crawler is pretty easy because it already has a vehicle burner generator, so it can provide its own power fairly easily. But I put some batteries in here just so the belt immunity would work. And all that stuff has been upgraded. So before we can make effective use of our new bus here, we need to have a loading station. Now, we could have lots of loading stations, but I went through the effort of building, which one is it? Here we go. A nice dynamic loading station, and it's fairly complicated, so we'll have to get into that. But we also need to build all the resources that go into it, so before we start building things, we should probably do that. And this does involve some new technologies, mainly just for fun, so we might as well research that stuff. The one thing is these Nixie tubes, which is a cool mod where it's basically just lights that you can put in the world and hook them up to a circuit network, and then the lights will just tell you what the number is of the signal you want. It makes it really easy to view a complicated process from afar without having to constantly hover over all the buildings, and I definitely use those in this setup. So we'll grab that. That's just the standard Nixie tube. And then you could take the research further, which gives you more shapes you can use. I like to use these small ones because this is a 1x1 square, but it gives you 2 numbers. This is a 2x1 square that only gives you 1 number. So I like using these small ones just because you could put more of them in a smaller space. And it's all just basic steel stuff that we can do. So we'll grab that. It's kind of a little bit of a mod showcase here because I'm just researching random things. I didn't end up using this inventory sensor here, but it's still relevant to making dynamic loading stations, or just loading stations in general, where the default behavior of LTN is that it always loads every train to maximum capacity. And you definitely want it to be like that, because if you turn that setting off with finish loading here, you could turn it off, and then the second the train gets what it has been requested, it'll just instantly leave. But the problem is like it says here, inserters will get stuck. So in other words, the inserter will swing and just hover and hold an item. This is fine if all of your stations only use one item type at a time. But if you have a dynamic station that handles more than one product at a time, or a specific inserter has to handle more than one product at a time, you'll get stuff getting stuck, and that'll be a problem. So you definitely want to finish loading. So the proper way to handle it, even as recommended on the mod form, is to use the mod called Inventory Sensor. And it's just, I guess called Circuit Network 2. And we'll cover it in a second. But basically what it does is it allows you to find the inventory of anything you connect it to. So you can connect it to a train to find out the cargo on a train. You can connect it to a smelter to find out what's inside the smelter. You can connect it to a vehicle to find out how much fuel it has. So you can use it to do a lot of interesting stuff like that. So if you don't do the dynamic loading the way I did, which I'll show you in this blueprint, this is another optional way. So I figured I would just research it to show you the different ways of doing things. And this also has its own uses. So once that's researched, I'll kind of go over that a little bit. I think that's pretty good for now. This research might happen pretty quickly. But one problem the bus is kind of having here is that we're starting to run into a problem of not having resources. For example, we unhooked the production to make the paper boards. And now we don't have circuits anymore. And yes, I could run the circuits down here from our circuit bus, but since this is going to be rebuilt, I don't really want to do that. So instead, since the infrastructure already exists, like clearly there's already a request depot here, we can just create a supply depot to send boards there and then let the drones handle it. Also, the factory's kind of chronically low on stone because it's just not doing much resource processing anymore. So we could deliver a bunch of stone products, but I think the easy way around this is just to deliver straight up stone and send it in here. And we've already got like a dump spot that was used for stone, so we probably can put a request depot right here. We can kind of plop that in there. We can give priority to the stone from regular processing and only put in stone if it can't keep up with this machine right here. So we'll request stone, and we'll probably need a bunch of drones for this. Let's see, probably like 20 drones, and we'll get another 5 to put in for the paper boards. So we'll put those drones in there. Yeah, because actually it looks like research has basically stopped because we don't have those circuits anymore, which are necessary for green science there. So If we want to research all this stuff, we definitely have to get this fixed. Okay, stone is being produced right here. And it was the intent to actually hook this up to something at some point. There's not really room for a train here anymore, so it would have to be by drone anyway. There we go, we can put that in there. Actually, that alignment looks a little bad, because if it was one over, it would be lined up perfectly straight here. So that can come in. We'll set a circuit condition here for stone. And we have 20 drones on this task, which is like, that's a lot of stone. Let's say like 4,000. Then we had to do these paper boards, which is being delivered by train right here. And that seems like it's getting delivered. And let's put a few more drones in there for good measure. Alright. Hopefully in a few moments, everything will get updated and start working again. Okay, we have most of the resources we need for this design. Now we just need the Nixie tubes. And lots of nanobots, which we are now producing again because we have stone. And there we go. The green is flowing. Ah, this is so slow compared to our circuit bus. And Nixie tubes are actually kind of hard to build. So let's actually create a production line while we're waiting on them. So we want to make the small reinforced ones, which we have to make from the regular tubes. And let's just make it by one machine at a time. So we can have one machine flanked by basically two. I don't know if this is truly worth putting on the bus, but they just take forever to build, so it probably is. Actually, on second thought, maybe we should just do the limiting factor here, just to make it easier to build. This is an opportunity to use our new electronics assemblers. Okay. I think this will get the job done. We'll just limit it to 50 for now. And plop it in here. Okay, that should be all the resources we need. Just gotta wait for the research to finish. Okay, we got the Nixie tubes. So we'll set this up. Let's see. I'll make a couple of other random tubes here. Kind of give you an idea of how it works. Where you have these standard ones, which are the tall tubes. Then you got these big flat ones. And then the ones I like are the little flat ones. There we go. So you put it there, and then you connect the wire to the first light on the right to what you want to get a signal from here. And unfortunately, it doesn't work when you use something like anything or everything. You have to actually tell it what it's looking at. So you select small reinforced Nixie tube, and then there it is. It says we have 9, which we do. We can apply that there. And luckily, when they're connected in a line like this, you don't have to keep applying the circuit condition to every single thing, only the one on the right. And that's basically how they work. It's definitely a pretty thing, I guess. But it certainly comes in handy when you have really complicated setups where, especially if it's a circuit network, where you have all these combinators and you're hovering over everything trying to figure out what's going on. Well, this is nice to just tell you what the numbers are. So I definitely included them in this dynamic loading station because it can be a little hard to follow what's happening. So I just use these because they're small and they seem like they're just as readable as anything else. And you see, they do take a long time to make. So if you want to handcraft these, especially if you have the 1-digit version, it can take you a long time to handcraft stuff. So just put it on the bus for these. And we need 54 of them. So, yeah. That's the reason why I wanted to put it on here. Okay. I think with that, we have everything we need. So let's go down there and build it. We gotta find a place to put this thing. It is quite large. Fortunately, when I was placing this, it didn't consider the fact that the loading station would actually be wider or longer than the unloading station. So we can't really put it up here. I mean, we probably could if we wanted to move all those belts around, but that's kind of annoying. So if we just place it down here, it'll actually fit when it's lower than those belts. So let's space it out and leave room for one more of these. So basically, like right here. So now we know how much space it would take. And that would be the output of the warehouse. So we just need to place it down here far enough to where that belt wouldn't get in the way of anything. And it looks like it would be about right here. But we've got trees and whatnot in the way. And we've got those pipes in the way too. Probably going to have to need to move those out of the way. But let's go in here and clean some of this up. So we'll place this in here, right there, and have lots of stuff to set up. We could probably just continue these pipes back. Looks like it's blocked right here. So if we go one lower, and get it in there. One thing that's important when placing these big LTN blueprints is don't make the LTN combinator until you're ready, because if you have that thing set to on, then the second this connects, it's going to start sending trains, and it's probably not going to be the right things because you copied it from a different station. So just be careful about how you build these. Okay. I think that's mostly built. Let's make sure it's lined up. Should be. Looks like it. Okay. Well, before we cover what that station does, let's cover the inventory sensor real quick, since it's been researched. So it's a basic combinator like anything else. So the way the inventory sensor works is you attach it to basically the thing you want to read. So we have our car right here. We can place that next to the car and you see how it's reading everything that's on the car, including its equipment, including the amount of fuel that is currently in the engine, this bar right here. Like everything. So how is this relevant to a train? Well, let's say you had some parked trains, which we will have here. Let's grab a piece of wood there. We are going to have some trains parked here. But let's say you had a depot, which this is a depot, and you had parked trains. You can put the inventory sensor on the train and it tells you what we're dealing with here, where it's connected to a train, and that's all there is. But let's say we had an inserter putting fuel in, and if we put 100 pieces of wood in there, now it says there's 100 pieces of wood. So let's say you had a train and you didn't like the idea that it held 3 stacks of fuel everywhere it went, that you had really valuable fuel. Well, what you can do is you can put an inventory sensor on every single train and say, only fill it up until it has this many stacks of items. It's kind of hard to see when it's that direction, so let's do it the other way so it's a little easier. And I don't know if it really matters which way you put the inventory sensor. Okay, it does. So the back side is the side that has the cables on it that you connect with wires. So you have to face the front side of it to the thing you want to read. So like the train. And now we have our signals. So let's take the fuel out. Let's say you had an inserter here filling up with fuel, and let's just say it was a belt, but here's a chest right here. And we put our wood in there. You know, if we just do this, it just runs constantly. But we'll connect it to the inventory sensor. And let's say the enabled condition is that our fuel type, which in this case would be wood, is less than, let's say we wanted to have 20 pieces of wood in this train. We set that. And boom, it stops. Because now the train has 20 pieces of wood and it says train is fueled. So the trains hold a ton of fuel. Now, I don't know if I want to go through my entire factory using inventory sensors on every single train. It depends on the fuel type. I think if it was fuel blocks, maybe, but rocket fuel, well, rocket fuel is actually not that hard to make. But if you had something really rare, you might want to do this. But that is an application of the inventory sensor. Now, how it pertains to dynamic loading stations with LTN is that the default behavior is that LTN will load until the train is completely full. Well, it's pretty easy that when your train parks, you put an inventory sensor, and it's connected to the train car, so it is going to take up a slot here. But let's say you had a loading station. Let's put a stack inserter in there. And let's say we were loading, I don't know, plastic pipes. And let's say you wanted to load a train to a certain amount. Well, you can connect it to there and say, we want plastic pipes to be 50. So we set it to 50, put our plastic pipes in. The train would come in and get loaded. And then it stops. So that is how you would use the inventory sensor to load a train partially with LTN. And specifically, what you would do is you would connect that, well, and there's actually a third one because the LTN combinator there, but each LTN station has an input and an output. Right now, we've been using the input because we've told the train what we want. So if we come up to one of these other stations, we have our LTN combinator hooked up to the input. So we're telling the station, these are the things that we want, and LTN combinator just saves us from having to put all the signals in manually. If you wanted to control how the station loads, you would use the output. Because if a train comes in, the output will be what that train is asking for, which would tell the dynamic station what to give it. We are actually using this a little bit. So with this carbon depot here, where I kind of did a little trick here where I combined a depot and a loading station, that is what's telling these inserters to turn on, is they have this wire going to the output. So when the train gets a carbon request, it pulls forward, the output will send a carbon signal, and that carbon signal will be the exact quantity of resources that the train is requesting. And that would go through, and all the inserters are waiting for is there a signal? And if there is, they run. They don't care about quantity. But with inventory sensor, you can easily use it to where the inventory sensor and some logic is comparing against the train's request. So the inserters will only run while the train has less than the request. Once it meets the request, all the inserters stop. And that is how you would send a train partially full. Because with LTN, if you don't want to get resources stuck in inserters or stuck on trains, you need to have the ability to partially load trains in one way or the other. If you don't, you're going to run into problems. So you need to find a way with mods or how you set up LTN to make that happen. An inventory sensor is really useful for that, but its uses actually go even farther than that. Because you can use inventory sensor on manufacturing machines as well. So let's just say this one right here. We hook it up, and now it says the output signal is 16 copper plates. Because we click this, it has 16 copper plates inside. Well, how would we use that? Well, you would use that to stop a machine from running if you didn't want it to fill up all the way. So with this assembling machine, it fills up to 16 and it stops. Big deal, who cares? Well, that's not where you'd want to use it. You would want to use it on one of these machines that fills up to an entire stack. So notice how each one of these plate machines and these cast machines, they fill up to an entire stack of resources. Well, if you didn't want that to happen, you can put inventory sensors on each and every one of these and tell the input that goes in the station to stop giving it an input if it's full. Now, we can't really do that with liquids. I mean, we could, we just need a pump for every single one. So that's not the best example. More relevant might be bricks, but even these ones, like the standard furnace, will fill up to a stack of bricks, but the filtering furnace will only do a couple. But probably the biggest application I can see of using that in this factory is this giant crystallizer grid, because each and every one of these crystallizers can hold 200 of each resource that they can produce. So if it produces iron and copper, it can hold 200 of both iron and copper, and that is an immense amount of resources that get stuck into this thing. And I don't think it still hasn't been filled up, so it's still not operating technically correctly. It's set up correctly, it's just, you know, you have to preload a build before it'll actually start operating normally. Now, the input of all of these is liquids, yes. So we would have to have a pump on each and every one of these to make it work, but we could, where each and every one of these had a pump, and we would connect that pump to an inventory sensor, which would have to be on every one of these machines, and tell it to only fill up until it's got, I don't know, 10 of a resource, and then stop. So that would prevent these things from having all of these resources stuck in them. So inventory sensor is definitely a neat little mod. And these signals down here are the extra signals that it's adding. So you see how right here it's got the little clock icon here? Well, that's its progress. So you see how the number is flickering on the right of the screen here? And there it goes. That is showing the actual percent progress of the machine. So it's actually got a lot of interesting signals that you can use. And those signals are down here. So things like crafting progress, the temperature, megajoules of fuel, and then whether or not any of these vehicles have been detected. So it has lots of uses. So if it's something you think you could upgrade your factory with, I highly recommend it. And it is the recommended mod for getting LTN to partially load trains if you need to do it that way. And we do need to cover how this whole setup works. But one more thing before we do that. So I wanted to note that I modified some of the requester settings here. It basically operates the same way, but perhaps describing it in this way might make it a little easier to understand. Where the output signals here, the negative signal, is the size of the buffer that you want. And I've noticed that LTN is accurate enough to where you don't really need to leave a buffer. At least with this setup. Maybe with a different setup you might want to. So you could just say, well, what's the size of the buffer that resources go into? Well, with our copper sheet coils here, it's a 256 slot warehouse. So come in here and say the output is negative 256, which means LTN will try to give you a full warehouse of resources. And there's no buffer or safe zone in here. It's going to fill it up to the tippy top if it can. And then with the request stack threshold, that is how low it has to be from the tippy top before it'll send a train. So it's set to 160 stacks. So in other words, when this is 160 stacks low from the tippy top, it'll send a train. And if no resources get used, when it comes back, it's going to be right at the top. And I found that this works pretty well. LTN is fairly accurate with the trains that it sends, if you have these things set up sensibly. To try to imagine how all this works, try to imagine the different conditions. So let's say, you know, this warehouse right now it's at negative 25k. And I think it has to be negative 32k to send a train. That's what 160 stacks is. Well, if it's 160 stacks short, it'll send a train. Will that train actually get loaded with 160 stacks? Not necessarily. That is simply the maximum that it will come back with. It will only come back with 160 stacks if the provider station had it to give. Our provider stations are set with a 40 stack threshold. So in other words, they have to have at least 40 stacks before they'll send a train. So it's possible that this warehouse could be 160 stacks short, but it's only going to send a train that's going to come back with 40 stacks simply because that was all that was available. And anywhere in between, LTN will make the relevant request. But like I mentioned earlier, when we were reviewing LTN Manager and the stations and their requests, that just because you request, say, 1,000 of something, doesn't mean the train's actually going to be loaded with 1,000. It all depends on how you set up the station. So most of our stations, in fact all of them, are set up to where it will fully load the train regardless of what the request is. So if we requested 1,000 tin coils, it doesn't matter. It's going to get loaded with 32,000 because there's nothing stopping these inserters from filling up the train. So they are absolutely going to fill up the train, and that's fine because it's one train going in, and that's not going to cause issues. When it causes issues is when you have multiple resources going through. So when reviewing how this dynamic loading station works, try to keep that in the back of your head. You got to think, how is this station not going to give a train too many resources? And there's essentially two ways of doing it. One, I kind of already described with the inventory sensor. But in other words, you monitor the amount of resources that are on the train and only load the relevant amount. I should say there's three. That's one. Another way is to do direct insertion. So in other words, multiple trains might come through here, but any given inserter will only insert one resource. And here's a sample design I was working on that this is the loading section of the build where it has 4 belts going in on each side. So it's an 8-belt station. And then it's got all these filter stack inserters to pick up resources going into each warehouse. And in fact, I don't think there's enough of them on here because each one of these warehouses needs to have 8 stack inserters on them. Basically, it becomes very logistically complicated to do it that way, where you have to load each warehouse with every resource that any train might come through with to make sure that it's available for that train. And this works, and it's more compact than what I've done, but setting up all of these inserters with the filters would just be pain. And yes, you could use a combinator for that, but it's not that simple because each one of these belts would have to be very specifically set up for this whole thing to work. And I was just like, no, I don't want to do it that way. Too much work. So I ended up doing it this way, which the final method of making sure a specific amount of resources get put on the train is by counting. So that's what this does, is that it receives a request and it counts the exact amount of resources until it meets the request, and then it stops. And this handles 6 belts at a time, so it has a lower throughput than the other station, simply because there's only so many slots on a warehouse here. So it's still 8 belts going in to make it symmetrical here, but it's actually a 6-belt design as opposed to an 8. And there are other ways of doing it, like this monstrosity right here. This is an 8-belt design of the same thing without all of the combinators and everything on there. Does it work? Yes. But it's just much larger. When you compare it, it's just bigger. Is it really worth it to do this, to get 8 belts on one station, when you can just build another 6-belt station? I didn't think so. So that's why I didn't continue building that design either. But in the end, I came up with this. But that's the end of this episode. You're going to have to wait till the next one where I explain how it works. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.